Alright, so I thought I'd make a video on something that I think has been happening in our culture for a while, which is Christian revivalism, and how people are waking up to the fact that whether you happen to be a religious person or not, the average person cannot live without a certain amount of faith in axiomatic moral principles. In one of my recent previous videos, I said that atheists are selfish. And that's because I understand that some people could have taken that the wrong way. I don't really care, but I feel like I do owe them at least a bit of an explanation. And that explanation is this. If you don't ground your beliefs in a higher principle, then you will end up falling for just sort of random, chaotic beliefs. You'll end up falling for political tribalism, generally speaking. And unless you're extremely, extremely intelligent, we're talking like 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 5,000 people won't fall prey to those because they'll be able to rationalize themselves out of it. But for most people, they aren't going to be logical, so they need beliefs, and they need a tribe, and they need their justifications. And maybe they can learn to overcome that, but I wouldn't lose any sleep waiting for it, because a lot of people just aren't capable of that. So societies need to recognize this moral vacuum and adopt a belief system that characterizes the society. And the more explicit you are about that, the better, because it sets up very clear moral guidelines for your society. And maybe those will be good, maybe they'll be bad, but you should at least know what they are so you have a standard. You're going to have a standard. The question is it going to be implicit and random and sort of democratically decided upon, which ultimately ends in an oligarchy of experts, or is it going to be more direct? Now, of course, our society was founded by people of the Christian persuasion, and more specifically of the Puritan persuasion, so it doesn't really surprise me that most of our institutions are adopting a puritanical stance to things they don't like. See cancel culture, see mobbing. I mean, people have compared this to witch burnings, rightfully so. People compare it to crucifixion, but just realize that all of those are of the Protestant persuasion, of the Christian persuasion, because our society was founded by Protestant separatists, aka Puritans. So, although I am not a Christian, I'm a little bit too eclectic for that. I understand the value of it, and I have no problem dealing with Christians and talking to them, because I'm not a snob. And this being said, I think it's important that as we go through this weird religious revival period where new atheism and materialism is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions and social impossibility, we have to embrace that spirit that people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris claimed to embody before they went insane. Richard Dawkins isn't really insane. I think he's just got some unexamined first principles. Sam Harris went insane. Trump drove him insane. Anybody who claims that Trump is a Nazi or that he's a fascist or that he's, democracy dies in darkness, these are all insane things that are the end product of basically an atheistic, materialistic worldview. And these sort of unexamined religious liberal principles But that being said, I think it's important to embrace the spirit of what they were trying to get at, which is to realize that there's a certain amount of people who are not very comfortable with the idea of parables, who are not very comfortable with the idea of metaphorical truths or spiritually functional things. And these stories that are for them, they're not content to just view them as stories that are a storehouse of information and moral guidance. They're more inclined to view these things as historical fact because in their mind, and I kind of am sympathetic to this belief, it's very hard for them to square the idea that something could be not literally true, but if you act on it, you get ahead of people who don't have that belief system. There's a difference between something being functional and something being true. And I think it's pretty important for people to recognize that distinction. This being said, some of the ways that they can justify that historical pertinence of their stories to themselves can stretch the boundaries of truth a little bit too hard in the same way that things like transgenderism do. We can't be willing to sacrifice truth for comfort. That's usually a very bad idea. And as Christianity inevitably becomes more dominant with the decline and failure of, dialectical materialism and liberalism and the new atheists, we're going to see a rise of these sort of literalist types. It's inevitable. It's inevitable. It's just a function of probability and a normal distribution of intelligence. We're going to see literalists. It's coming. They're going to be a different sort of literalist than existed in like the 18 and 1900s because we have different levels of understanding, There are some that I'm even more sympathetic to. People like Stephen Meyer, who's an old earth creationist and intelligent design guy. I think he makes extremely compelling scientific cases for intelligent design. Now, I don't think you can take that and assume that, Jesus is the Son of God or anything like that. I don't even think you can take the concept of intelligent design and get the classical attributes of the Jewish Lord. But I think that you can make scientific claims when you're not trying to bite off more than you can chew with the available evidence. Now, I've been meeting with some Christian missionaries for a few months now, and just to see where they're at, to see where the current state of Christian evangelism is at, because if it's inevitable that we're going to be dealing with more of these people, we need to get familiar with it. So I've been dealing with them a little bit and seeing where they're at and how they think. They're good people. They really are good people. And, I've been trying to expose them to my ideas of polytheism and all these things and sort of more Jungian stuff. And they're uncomfortable with it, but they're trying to persuade me of their monotheistic belief systems, which is about as easy as trying to convince me that I'm a solipsist and that I'm the only person in the world. But they're trying, and I admire them for that. And I think it's important to be able to talk to people of different persuasions and trade evidence. But there is a guy named John Warner, I believe. His last name is Warner. And he wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity. And Cold Case Christianity is an analysis of the 4 Gospels that are at the end of the New Testament, which are allegedly 4 eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. And I don't think he's particularly compelling, but I thought that this strain of apologetics was interesting enough to make a video on and sort of point out what he's trying to do and where he goes wrong and why. And I hope that this will be helpful to some people. So the first thing he does is this guy, Jay Warner, was a detective. He was a murder detective. And the thing about dealing with like murders and whatnot is that you have to deal with a lot of eyewitness testimony. So he decided to try to use that on the Bible. Now there's some problems with this straight away. For starters, everybody's been dead for 2,000 years. There's a lot of fuzzy stuff going on, and you're not trying to prove a murder, which is relatively mundane. You're trying to prove that these like crazy miracles happened, and furthermore, you're trying to extrapolate from all those miracles that happened that the guy who is doing all the miracles is therefore basically God, and not only God, but there are no other gods, and he's the only one. So I think this is fundamentally impossible from the perspective of a detective, but nonetheless, we all start from our own presuppositions and standpoints, and I'm willing to hear him out. So he lists 4 ways that you would be able to judge evidence. Now, I want to point out that there's a difference between proof and something that makes something more likely. So, like for instance, if I'm trying to prove that somebody stole something, let's say I'm in court and I think somebody stole something, but I don't necessarily know for sure. I'm going to say, let's say that I said this person was in the store at X time when the thing was stolen, and he had motive to steal it, and why wouldn't he? Well, that's not proof. That's just a series of correlated incidents that might make it more possible for him to steal, but it's not proof that he stole it. So, in the absence of all of that, should I say he didn't steal it? No, I should just say I don't know. And it's fine to not know. That's the biggest thing. It's fine to not know. And I understand why some people might want to know, why some people might be extremely uncomfortable with not knowing, but it's okay not to know things. You can still believe things to be useful if you don't know them. All right, so that being said, the 4 ways that he deals with eyewitness testimony. Number 1, were the eyewitnesses actually present? Now, in order to justify that these 4 gospel writers were actually present, what Jay Warner does is he references the fact that none of them mentioned the siege of Jerusalem, which happened in 70 AD by Nero Caesar. And, that would be reasonable, except for the fact that the siege is alluded to in one of the Gospels. But it's alluded to as a prophecy, something that's going to happen in the future. Now, in order to view that as proof that the Gospels were written before 70 AD, we have to assume off the bat that whoever's saying this is a prophet. I believe it was actually Jesus who said this, but we have to assume precognitive ability of somebody that we don't even know. So that's already assuming what we know to be true before we know it. So the best actual explanation for this, the most parsimonious explanation without assuming what we know to be true already, is that the siege of Jerusalem had already happened and they wrote it artificially from the perspective of somebody who lived before so that they could fulfill the prophecy and give it more clout. Now, we do know that the New Testament is full of references to Old Testament prophecy. So it's not that much of a stretch to say that they're filling in prophecies as they go and also writing from the perspective of somebody who lived 50 years earlier to give themselves the appearance of legitimacy. That actually is the most parsimonious explanation without assuming that the author had access to precognitive ability and prophecy. So there's that. I know some people aren't going to like this because I'm basically calling him a liar. And all I'm saying is that if you want to believe in magic, that's fine, but don't think that proves your claim. Don't think that just assuming that somebody is a psychic in history is accurate historical analysis. That's already starting with the conclusion, and that's unscientific. If that doesn't bother you, fine, but don't try to make anybody else believe it because it's not true. It's not accurate. It's not a good process. So there's that. So the strongest case that I've seen for the dating of the Gospels is around 120 AD because there were a few Roman and Jewish scholars who referenced them sort of in letters to each other. So let's say a few hundred or like 120-ish AD is when these things were when we can definitively say that these things were in circulation. So let's say they were written in 100 AD. That would mean that the people who wrote them were very likely not present in the lives of Jesus and might not have even been present in the lives of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So what that means is that the eyewitnesses were not present, that they were hearing stories and writing stories that may or may not have happened. Furthermore, the accounts of the New Testament, of the Gospels, some of them reference Jesus alone, but the Gospels were not written by Jesus, like when he's out in the desert or when he's on the water on the mountaintop alone, in the Garden of Gethsemane alone. So no, these were not written by eyewitnesses. They were written by people who lived several generations after the fact, after the events did or did not transpire. So already his main argument just goes out the window. But let's look at more historical evidence that he brings up. And I use the word evidence loosely, unfortunately, because I genuinely want to know the truth, and I don't want to lie to myself. And when people lie, I find it offensive, not because I don't trust their intentions, but because they're perverting the process of truth, and I view truth as more important than religion. So, anyway. The historical evidence that he brings up is for things in the Old Testament, like the flood and the Tower of Babel. And allegedly, he quotes some Babylonian traditions that say that the Babylonians had a very similar flood myth with an ark and a Tower of Babel and all this stuff. And a god Enki, their god Enki, confused the tongues of people after they built this tower reaching up to the sky. Now, I shouldn't have to point out to you that this is an absurd argument to make from a monotheistic tradition by citing a desert polytheistic tradition that came several thousand years before the time that your religion comes from. So you have this monotheistic religion citing the god Enki as proof of its existence, as proof of its historical existence. That's insane. That completely invalidates all of his points. So there are a couple more ways that he views, that he judges eyewitness testimony. One of them is, do the witnesses, or did they change their story across time? Now this is an interesting one because I think it's pretty clear that the writers of the New Testament Gospels are not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're not written by people who ever knew Jesus. They're just sort of written by people who heard stories and wrote them down. So it doesn't really matter whether or not these stories changed across time. There are some discrepancies in the tales, but it's not really hard to rewrite something after it's been written down. So I don't think that this is extremely relevant, but I will point out that Jay Warner does say that that basically he doesn't really care if the witnesses line up or if the stories line up exactly, because he says that eyewitnesses at the scene of a murder, they don't always say the same thing, which is true. People's emotions and perceptions, where they're standing in the room, it does change people's perceptions of an event. But since these people weren't there at the time of the whole story they're writing about, it doesn't really matter to me anyway. And the final thing is he talks about the bias of the people who were writing these accounts of what happened. Now, there's this thing I hear a lot from New Testament people, from Christians, which is like, well, if they were being put to death, why would they lie? Like, would you die for something that you knew was a lie? And I think people will actually die for things that they know are not true. All the original point that these stories were not written down by people who actually saw the events all that aside, people are definitely willing to write things down that are untrue or that are fictional in order to make political change, in order to start religions, in order to subvert authority. Like, think about Animal Farm, or things like the Gulag Archipelago is truthful, but think about all these books that have been written about, like, in propaganda about communist regimes and fascist regimes, these books that are meant to undercut the authority of people. And then a lot of those people who wrote books and pamphlets like that were killed because they were trying to subvert an authority that wanted them dead, and they did it through parable, through clever stories, through propaganda. Now, I don't know whether these tales were propaganda or not, but I know that it's possible that they were. And they definitely had an effect of bringing down and changing and subverting the Roman Empire that was very hostile to the Jews at the time. So in terms of this sort of historical analysis of what's going on, or what I think was going on, here are the claims being made by this guy, Jay Warner. One, this is what we can deduce from the evidence about the historicity of the New Testament. One, we know that these things were written maybe a couple generations after, 1 to 2 generations after the events transpired, not by eyewitnesses. 2, he's willing to cite polytheistic traditions as historical proof that this monotheistic Jewish tradition is real. That's absurd. And 4, people are willing to absolutely die and lie for what they believe in, and especially if they think by doing so they might save large numbers of their countrymen, their tribe, their group, whatever. And that's fine. So if you want to go on believing that these things are direct historical accounts of miraculous events, you're free to do that, I suppose, but don't pretend that that's a scientific claim. Don't pretend that that's a historically accurate claim. And also, finally, just because people do miracles does not mean that they are a monotheistic God, or it doesn't mean that they're a God, and it doesn't mean that they're monotheistic, that the universe is monotheistic. I think the universe is very clearly polytheistic, and while there might be a hierarchy of divinity, of spirits, the universe is definitely not monotheistic. People could be monotheistic, people could choose to worship one God or another, but the universe is certainly not monotheistic. So, yeah, that's basically my review of just the sort of Christian culture that we're entering, and also like the decline of new atheism, and this guy, Jay Warner, and his book, Cold Case Christianity. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and sorry for being long-winded, but this topic is complicated, and it requires a complicated video to address. So, till next time.